Hello, welcome to another Corruption Chronicles podcast. Tonight we have a guest returning who was with us once before, Bill Ostrander, and we are going to talk about dark money. So I guess doing a podcast at night, it's good timing if we're talking about dark money. It's pretty dark
Yeah.
around here in
Yes.
more ways than one. And I first encountered dark money when I was running against someone else in a mayoral campaign, and I noticed that there was a lot of money in that campaign. And I was trying to figure out where it all came from. And just so folks know, you can get this information just by going to the website of whatever agency folks are running for. So if it's the city, you go to the city's website and they will have transparency information, and you can find out who's donating to the people that you are voting for or not voting for in some cases. And so that's how I got this information. I downloaded it and I found that my opponent had probably, oh my goodness, 29 donations from cannabis organizations. And that's not a problem necessarily, except that almost all of those were associated with one or two people, maybe three or four people, who wanted to open dispensaries in town. And they had applications before the city. They had planning applications. They'd spent a lot of money applying for these dispensaries, or sometimes other cannabis businesses that we were opening up in Grover Beach. And none of the names on the donations were the same as the names on the applications for the permits. And so I began to wonder. So I started looking, I started Googling, I started connecting, and I knew quite a lot of what was going on locally because I was on the city council or had been the mayor previously. And as I went through it, I found out that they were either employees of these folks who were applying for cannabis permits, or they worked for the folks who were applying for cannabis permits, or they were on the campaign for the people who had cannabis permits. But none of them were the names of the people who were applying for the permits. So, in a sense, that was dark money. There was, and $3,000 isn't a lot of money in many, many campaigns. And I know Bill will tell you that in a moment. But for a small local campaign, $3,000 coming in really almost only from folks who wanted to be granted a permit was a little bit dodgy. So, and that's when I really started understanding the term dark money. And dark money actually is somewhat a white collar crime. And so we find often, although white collar crime accounts for about 6 times as much money as our illegal drug trafficking trade, at least according to some of the experts on it online, it's not really prosecuted. And if you're involved in white collar crime, you get a special jail cell, you go to a special jail, you don't end up with the normal criminals, and sometimes you get to go home with something attached to your leg. And we simply do not go after it in the same way. We tend to overlook it or treat the folks who are hiding 6 times more money and probably generating 6 times more financial crime than those who are doing what we think of as the more violent or the more normal crimes. So I wanted to just mention that. I wanted to come in on the easy level. And what we do on Corruption Chronicles is talk about corruption and ways to solve it. And so Bill mentioned something to me about a week ago that he was looking at that was on a much, much, much bigger level than $3,000 on the local level. But I thought if we start locally, it might be easier to kind of wrap our heads around the kind of stuff, the ways that people hide where money is coming from when they want something from someone who's running for political office or in political office. So I'm going to introduce Bill now. This is Bill Ostrander, and he's been with us in another few podcasts, and I think you'll see him again. We have a lot to talk about. And Bill has really personal experience from a couple of campaigns. So I'm going to let him take it away and explain what his concerns are, and we'll talk about that a little bit.
Well, thank you for having me again, Debbie. I appreciate it. And it's such an important subject because, democracy is based on the concept that we're going to have a discussion over common interests, and then we will make decisions based on what the common interest is for all of us, or for the 51%. The problem that we have seen in the 20th and the 21st century is that money, which is considered speech by the Supreme Court, and I'll explain that in a minute, opportunes the wealthiest among us to co-opt or to filibuster the arguments, or to manipulate things to such an extent that people are oftentimes unable to clearly understand the issue and to vote with critical reasoning rather than feelings. So, starting on what free speech is, or money is speech, let's just cover that real quickly since I brought it up. The Supreme Court recognizes money as free speech because even if you and I were to go to the park and debate an issue that everybody in the community could come witness in a park that doesn't cost us any money, we would still have to pay for transportation to get to the park. We might still buy an apple box to stand on. We might still pay for papers to hand out to the crowd and say, remember Debbie Peterson, remember Bill Ostrander, here's the issues, etc. We'd have to pay for a sign that's advertising who we are. So the Supreme Court recognizes, and I think this is not totally unfair, that money is essential to free speech, or equal to free speech, in the sense that it allows an individual to express their support for an idea or a candidate. Now, having said that, the real pickle comes in when you recognize that my free speech is limited to my bank account, and this person's free speech is limited to their bank account, and to a corporation's bank account, or to a union's bank account. So what we have is an inequality of speech, so that some people are using a bullhorn and others of us can only whisper in a room.
So it's kind of the same concept as a monopoly. When you talk about a corporation, or you talk about a union, or you talk about groups that are so big and so powerful that they can, how do you say, they can override pretty much everything else.
They shout down. If we want to keep it into the vernacular of speech, they're able to shout over and above and shout down any opposition. Right? So dark money, because that's the subject of tonight's podcast, is not everybody wants to be known when they, as the giver of money to support an issue or a candidate. So, for example, some companies, well, most companies want to make sure that they have not offended anybody, because anybody's a potential customer. But the CEO of that company, or even the board, but more likely it might be the CEO, has a preference for a candidate or an issue. And so they can donate money to a campaign and hide who it is that gave the money. It's the hiding of who gave the money that creates the term dark money. Now, how do they do that? Well, there are, as you mentioned earlier, things called independent expenditures. And the Supreme Court tries to walk this impossible philosophical tightrope between ideologies, between the dictates of the Constitution, and then sometimes their own understanding of politics. So what they do, or what they have done, is they have authorized they've authorized corporations and unions to give money from their general treasury funds towards electioneering campaigns. Now, they're not allowed to give directly to a candidate, but there are many ways around that. So dark money is money that comes to assist or to direct a campaign by people who don't wish to be known. Now, they hide that money typically at a federal level and oftentimes also in local and state levels through a nonprofit organization called a 501c4.
Mm.
The 501c4 is called a social welfare organization.
Oh, yeah.
A social welfare organization is classified by the IRS as an organization that was born to serve the community or serve the public interest. In the 1950s, the NAACP was taken to court because they wouldn't reveal their donors.
Wow.
The reason they wouldn't reveal their donors, because in the 1950s, there would be a lot of retribution for those people who were supporting the cause of African Americans in this country. The Supreme Court sided with the NAACP and said that they had a right to keep their donors private because they were engaged in matters of the community and they didn't want somebody out that then created a fear or a concern for somebody who might actually want to help their community, but didn't want the blowback or didn't want the retribution from somebody who disagreed with their position. So the NAACP won that court battle. Now, the IRS gets involved because the IRS has to determine whether or not that's a real 501c4 or not. And a 501c4 is allowed to give money to a political cause so long as it's not the majority of what they're doing.
Huh.
That makes sense?
Yeah. Interesting.
So if that corporation wants to give money or that individual wants to give money to an independent expenditure, meaning something that's not going directly to the candidate, but going to an expense that assists in a campaign or an issue, then they can give that money to a 501c4 and they are forever shielded from exposing who they are. However, the 501c4 is not supposed to give the majority of its funding to political causes. But the IRS has never precisely defined what that amount is. So, because they have in their verbiage that it shouldn't be the majority of their interests, there is sort of a standing opinion that as long as they don't give more than 49.9% of their revenues or their contributions to a political candidate or policy or issue, whatever, then they are tax free. The person who gave the money doesn't get a tax deduction for that money, but the corporation, or sorry, the 501c4 is not a taxable organization, and they can hide the money. So since 2010, when the Citizens United case was tested before the Supreme Court decided that corporations could use their general treasury funds to advocate for a candidate or for an issue. They cannot give directly to the candidate, but that's something that's very easy to get around. And we talked a little bit about this in our previous podcast.
Right.
So the way they get around it, for example, let's just say that you were going to run for Senate. You and I have known each other for a few years based on our commitments to community service. And I think I understand this in what you stand for. Well, if I started an independent, a political action committee supporting your campaign, I already know what you stand for. So if there's coordination, the coordination isn't direct, like I go and work for you in your office, but you tell your friend, our mutual friend, this is really what I need somebody to do for me. That person tells me I'm not working directly for the campaign. So it's really a silly distinction between working directly or giving money directly to a campaign or a candidate and actually just expressing yourself. But
So
that's the
it's
conundrum of the Supreme Court.
it's an issue of transparency, and it sounds an awful lot
Yeah.
like like when we have 5 people on a city council. At any given time, 3 of us cannot speak about something that's on the agenda.
Right.
But people have historically found ways around it, and now we're being told, "Oh no, you don't," by basically you tell one person and they tell another person, so it's not 3 of you together.
Right.
And it's kind of really the same thing. It's a similar type of a thing, and that's a form of avoiding transparency or making secret decisions. Really, and this is a kind of secret money almost, and a form of money laundering, really, and it still relates to transparency.
Well, we need to first understand that the people who are in office now, who are responsible for new legislation, by and large, are opposed to changing the rules because they use them successfully to get where they are. And once they're there, it's much easier to raise money as an incumbent than it is as a challenger. So they have a certain amount of skin in the game that they hope that it doesn't really change. I'm not saying
Mm.
all of them, because there are some really good people out there that are trying to make change. And But in the hypocrisy, just to show you how the system is set up, to show you the hypocrisy. When I ran for state assembly, if I got a contribution from somebody of $1,000 or more, I needed to report that within 24 hours to
Mhm.
the state's Fair Political Practices Commission. I got this money. They want that to be known because somehow they're of the opinion that $1,000 is going to change, my opinion, or it's going to influence me. And that's okay. I agree with that concept to some extent. However, recently, if you're watching the news, there was a $1.6 billion contribution to a 501c4 that fronts for political causes, conservative political causes. And we don't get to know, although we do, we actually got leaked, but we don't have the right to know who the contributor is. So $1,000, we need perfect transparency for. 1.6 billion, don't tell anybody, right? That's the
That's the
absurdity.
white collar criminal. Yeah, yeah.
That's the absurdity of the situation.
Hmm.
Now, in addition to that, there's another angle on this. So many people will set up a phony LLC or some type of
Hmm.
corporation in the weeks, months before an election.
Yes.
The day after the election, they close the doors, they take their signs down, they leave the store. You can't find those people anymore. The election is over, the damage is done, or their success was granted, or whatever it was. But you cannot go after those people because in many states, you don't even have to name who it is that's forming
That's
the
right.
LLC.
Yeah.
So you go to certain states and you form an LLC, and then you funnel a bunch of money into it. And then that LLC gives money to a 501c4, and then away they go, and nobody ever knows.
So we're money laundering, back to money laundering again. And I remember reading a website, looking at a website, and I'll see if I can get it and post it, and we'll folks can see what it is. But it was a former white collar criminal who now investigates similar types of white collar crimes, and he said that LLCs are the darkest of dark money because all you need, and certainly this is what I found when I was looking at questionable behavior with some of our public agencies, what I found is that there would be whole chains of LLCs that money would funnel
Right,
through. Presumably, money
right,
would funnel through.
right. Now, we do have a adjudicating body or committee to look at some of these issues on the federal level and in the state and local levels as well. But I'll start to the big fish, right? It's called the Federal Election Commission, FEC. Many people have heard of it, right? The Federal Election Commission is comprised of 6 people. 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. It is required in order to further an investigation or open an investigation on someone who has flouted the law, the campaign election rules, to have 4 people in agreement out of the 6 to further an investigation. So if you have 3 of one party and 3 of another party, how many investigations do you think they do?
Probably none, because no one can
None,
agree
because
because
they
it's an
never
even
get the
number.
4th person. And that's the way it's set up. It is built in paralysis.
Yeah.
So sometimes when there's somebody that's incredibly egregious, in their, violation of the law, say like, I think there was a gentleman who had put $100,000 in his freezer, literally cold cash in his freezer at home, and that was discovered. And in that case, it's so obvious that they kind of have to cave to it. But there are innumerable instances every single election where our election laws are flouted and nothing happens.
That's right.
And it's because of this paralysis, and because dark money, and because the IRS does not have a clear set of guidelines for these 501c4s, amongst other 501c companies, and because the process of raising money in itself can be corrupt. To your point earlier, when you were talking about the cannabis organizations, many people in our area know the saga of Adam Hill. Adam Hill was running for supervisor, and the issue of cannabis was an important election topic.
Yeah.
And the issue of issuing permits to open a dispensary was quite a contentious issue. Adam Hill needed to raise money to run his campaign. Adam Hill was in favor of cannabis dispensaries in our county. Adam Hill then would call these people that were supposed to be just supporters of him and basically arm twisted them by saying, look, you want my vote, you need to, and get your friends to give me $1,000 each so that I have campaign funds to win. Now, that's a gray area. It's a horribly unethical thing to do, but he wasn't entirely illegal. Because he didn't say, I won't vote for you. He just said, look, I need your support in order to be elected. But that in itself is the basis for a pay to play system where we depend on the wealthy who have disposable resources, disposable wealth, who are the largest contributors to our campaigns and our issues. So it's a conflict of interest. And I said this before in a previous podcast, when you have an individual running to be a community representative that is required to source the funds for their campaign from private sources.
I'm going to stop there and go back a little bit, because what you're saying about what happened with Adam Hill is very much it connects with what I was saying on a more local level, and that is that it's not just that he went and said to folks, "Hey, you want to play? I need you to donate 1,000 to my campaign, or you believe I'll support you. You better support my campaign." But then when they did support, I don't know about his campaign. I'm not going to say, because I haven't reviewed it, but I can tell you that when they did support his folks who agreed with him, who were on the same page as him in my town, that's when those supporters they probably gave their $1,000. I suspect, as I've heard from some of them, that it was under the table, some of it not, but you wouldn't have known it was them, because they did it in the name of their LLC. They did it in the name of, their secretary, their treasurer, whatever, but it wasn't clear where that money was coming from, because they all had applications before the city, and that's my assumption. At any rate, it was not clear that that's who it was.
Right. Well, the Supreme Court consists of 9 people who've never been in an elected office.
Mm.
And as a result of that, and in 2010, by the way, I don't think when the Citizens United decision was made, I don't think there were any justices that had ever been elected since Sandra Day O'Connor. She had survived some elections, and she knew that. But almost all the other justices or all the other justices on the present court have never been through election and have no understanding other than philosophical or intellectual about what it means to have money in politics. So their concept is not difficult to understand. If you want to support a candidate, you might need to get out there. And as I said, even if you go to a park, make some flyers, make a sign. And you can do that. And let's just say that candidate lives in New York rather than California. Well, you could do that from here without meeting the candidate. You can express yourself. That's what the Supreme Court wants. That's what we want in an ideal world. But we don't live in an ideal world. We don't live in a situation where we don't understand such things as avarice and greed. So we put laws in place in order to make it clear for those people who might be ethically challenged that you can't do this. And it's in the community interest to do that. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court is obtuse in the notion that there can be unlimited spending around elections, or there are these guardrails that prevent money from independent expenditures or from dark money getting into the campaign and influencing the campaign in ways that overwhelm the common interest or an individual's participation in the campaign. And really, that's what we want to get back to. We want to get back to and get back to whether it ever totally existed, probably not. But what we have to strive for, what we must strive for, is that my voice is as important as the Koch brothers, or as George Soros, or as Coca-Cola, or any other large-pocketed individual or corporation or union. We must all have a similar voice. We must
because otherwise we're not equal if we don't. Yeah. There's no equality.
Yeah, and then
I wanted to ask you, and we can talk about this a little bit more later, how you find out if this is what's happening. Obviously, there will be whistleblowers and leaks, as you've mentioned. But does a 501c4, are they required to report their income?
They do report their income, but they're not required to report their donors.
Okay. All right. So you really have no way of following up the chain. So like, for instance, if I can go to my city website and find out who donated to the candidates for city council and mayor. And then I can Google it and I can find out, if I know what I'm looking at and I start to be able to make connections, I can usually see where the dark money is. But with a 501c4, that's not possible. Is that right?
Right. You cannot.
Oh my gosh.
You cannot learn the identities of people in a 501c4.
Wow.
Now, if they wish to reveal them, or if somebody leaks, that's something else. That's the only reason we understand what happened in this $1.6 billion contribution. It was an individual who basically gifted a company to a conservative conservative 501c4 social welfare organization. By gifting it to them, he avoided approximately $450 million in taxes.
Now, wait a minute. How does that happen? So he's giving it to a charity? Is that what it is?
Correct.
It's considered a charity, so he doesn't have to pay taxes on it.
That's correct.
Oh, gee. Wow. Okay.
So they gave $1.6 billion. And essentially what he did is he gave them 100% interest in a private company. And then the nonprofit turned around and sold the company. And so the proceeds from the company were tax-free. So it's not that the person avoided paying $450 million. I mean, he did, but what he how he did it was to give it to a nonprofit who is not taxed, and then they sold the company, and so his contribution to them became a full 1.6 billion as opposed to 1.15, which is still
Wow.
an enormous amount of money. And by the way, that 1.6 billion is as much as the top 15 Democratic nonprofits combined in the
Oh,
last election
wow.
cycle. It's an enormous amount of money. Nobody has ever seen that level of contribution by a single individual.
Man, that's scary.
Yes.
Wow. So we end up really, you end up almost controlled by those kinds of sums of money.
Yes.
You can't, how do you do battle with that?
You have to understand something else that's very, very important, I think. Money in politics is disruptive, prejudicial, subjective, and influences where an issue goes, or whether or not a candidate's elected. We talked about that before.
Yes.
94% of the time, 93, 94% of the time, whoever spends the most money wins.
Yep.
But here's another level, even more insidious to me than that. The people that we get to choose from as candidates are first screened by the money people. So we get to choose from candidates who the wealthiest supporters first decide is worth giving money to.
Right.
And so you can look back to Sheldon Adelson, who is this billionaire casino owner in Las Vegas. And Sheldon Adelson entertained about 4 or 5 presidential candidates in the previous election cycle. I think it was 2012 or 2016. And the intent was for them to make good with him because he had pledged that he would spend $100 million in the election. So what we are left with as the constituents is to decide whether or not we want to choose the person that the money person has already chosen for us, and the rest of them go away.
Wow. So what do we do about that? Is there anything we can do about that? Term limits? That doesn't make any difference, really.
Term limits, term limits wouldn't be necessary if we had public funding of election. We've seen the data that shows that in Seattle, where they have a democracy voucher, where public money is used to fund candidates' campaigns, that incumbents are not so safe, that they are a number of incumbents who are defeated. And again, this is one of the reasons why there's little motivation, despite the fact that polls show that anywhere from 76 to 92% of Americans believe that money is having a deleterious effect on our politics and think that it should be changed. Right?
What was that number again? 76 to 92%?
That's correct, depending on where you go. And that's both parties. That's not any one party.
And so if there's no money in elections, if they're publicly funded and there's a much greater semblance of equality, then it's our vote that counts. It's our vote that creates the limit. It's our vote that determines the good guys from the bad guys, not how much money somebody else has to throw at it.
And that's because we are then focusing on ideas from a competitive field rather than who has the most money, who can overwhelm us with mailers in our mailbox and commercials on television and radio. And so public financing of elections is already celebrated in about 28 states for a variety of elections. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this. I'm sure you are. Many judges have to run an election campaign, right?
That's right.
Now,
but not the Supreme Court.
No, not Supreme Court.
At state and local level, I think, states can choose, but at most state and local levels, they do. So our judiciary is chosen democratically. Well, except so far as money is concerned, but it's determined by our votes. It's when you get to the federal level, the Supreme Court is determined by the president with, support or not support of the Senate. I believe it is.
Well, it's confirmation by the Senate. You're right.
Confirmation.
If you are a real student of how this stuff works, you'll know that when a candidate comes up or when somebody is nominated, there will be a political action committee formed, and they will spend millions of dollars to assist the confirmation of that candidate.
Well, how do they do that? I thought it just so here, let me be naive, and as I'm sure most of us are on this. So this person goes to all these Senate hearings and you get well, is it so where do they spend their money? Is it trying to trash them if they don't like them?
That's
Or
part of it. They will
mhm.
run advertisements if it's contentious. They will vet the candidate or smear the candidate. They will hire lobbyists where they go to Washington, D.C., and then they will go to the different senators of the parties that are most likely to support or vote against that candidate and spend their time and money in advocacy for or against that candidate. So money is still
Mm,
a part of the process, even at the Supreme Court level. But going
right.
back to the public financing of elections, how wrong is that in practice
Yes.
that a person running to be a judge
Yeah.
should have to raise money from the very people whose cases he or she may hear?
Of
So,
course.
in theory, it's a good idea that we're trying to democratically elect competent judiciary. But how many people do you know that really know the character of the judge themselves, or what they stand for, or have any experience before that judge? It is typically judges are elected by lawyers associations, by the bar, who sends out support or for and against. So it's totally wrong. Now, Supreme Court said that we can have publicly funded elections so long as we don't stop them from having privately funded elections. So you can
Ah,
have both. But we have seen in practical experience that people tend to gravitate towards the candidate who says from the beginning, I'm not taking corporate money. I'm not taking special interest money. I am
yeah.
I am going to fund my campaign through the taxes appropriated for a general fund for elections, and therefore it takes away the special interest influence. And I submit that it provides an insurance policy for that elected official, because they cannot be accused of of voting for something that they from an individual or a cause they didn't take money from.
See, the other thing about that is so amazing and so positive and constructive is that what you have then, and they may be in from a certain party, but what you have then is the reason I think that most people will support that candidate is because we really all want honest government. We want real representation. We want the money we pay in to come back to service, not to go wherever else, and not to be determined by special interests. And so it's something that binds us all together. And I've found that every single time that I've seen corruption routed in government, and I'm going to say in local government, that's really what I can speak to. But every single time, it's been people from every party, every religion, every sex, every gender, every ethnicity working together because they have one thing in common: they want honest government. And that's
Well,
kind of what you're talking about. People, the majority of people will choose the person who's not taking money.
however, I'll take one small exception to what you just said,
Uh-huh.
and that is that yes, while we all say we want good government, most of the time the caveat is so long as they agree with me.
Right. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
And
I
so
do
what
agree with you.
okay. So really what we're talking about is recognizing that we have a bias and that we must
Mhm.
put rules in place that acknowledges that bias rather than the ideological. So for that, I mean, if I am wealthy and can give as much as I want, ideologically, the Supreme Court is supporting my interest, my First Amendment right of free speech. They're not acknowledging the bias that comes along with um, money that influences candidates or influences the self interest. I didn't say that very well, so let me try that
Mm.
again. Ideologically, they're supportive of the free speech. That makes sense. But what they don't recognize is without more significant guardrails on how that free speech is appropriated, people will cheat. People will find ways to get what they want for their self-interest at the expense of the community.
Yes.
And until the Supreme Court can recognize that there is a community interest in all of this money that's floating around to manipulate our political discourse and the people that we elect and the legislation that we confirm, we will continue to get substandard candidates. We will continue to be thwarted on issues that really benefit all of us.
Yeah, I'm with you all the way on that. And I think it's really good to bring it up for folks to understand about it. Um, so the question we started with was, what can we do about it? I guess I come back to that. So what can we do about it?
Well, one, I think that we should be asking any candidate for any office what their position is on the campaign finance reform. That's first and foremost, because unless it becomes an issue or a decision issue for a candidate will be told by their campaign manager, yeah, I know you want campaign finance reform, and that's great. After you get in office, you can try to work for that. But in the meantime, you need to earn this money. You need to bring this money up.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the first decision the candidate makes that takes them down the path that eventually results in a negative association as a politician.
Right. And the campaign finance manager certainly has a vested interest, because if there's no money in the campaign, or there's less money in the campaign, he doesn't get, I mean, there are less jobs available for
Well, that
campaign
may be
finance
true, but
managers to get rich.
that campaign manager is going to be hired by other people if he manages to get his candidate to the
Mm-hmm.
winner of the election.
That's
And we
true.
know that
Yeah.
93% of the time, whoever spends the most money is going to win. So if you've got a candidate like dumb old me who says, no, 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 I'm not taking corporation money. No, 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 I'm not going to sit on the phone all day begging for money from wealthy donors. I have my chances of being successful in that office are reduced from, say, 50-50 down to 7% because I'm
So,
out fundraised.
so because you weren't spending most of your time and energy raising money, you were spending your time and energy researching the issues and speaking intelligently to the issues and hearing from people about what they wanted, which is what we expect and think that the people we are electing are doing for us. But that's not the reality.
No. What people don't know is that between 30 and 70% of the time, 30 to 70% of the time that elected officials in Congress are spending is not on issues related to their communities. It is on fundraising. Imagine
Wow.
that. Imagine that if you, as a realtor, spent 70% of your time off doing something else, but you still want to get paid. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, how can somebody, go to work in any field and spend 70% of their time doing something completely unrelated to the business of that they have been hired to do?
So I don't know how much of their time they spend actually in congressional meetings and actually, legislating and determining legislature and voting and those sorts of things. But if they're spending 30 to 70 raising money and then a good chunk of their time in Congress, then they don't have any time for anything else. They don't
Well,
have time to research the issues. They don't have time to go talk to people and find out what their constituents really want and need.
that's true. And there are other types of PACs which we haven't even talked about, like leadership PACs. Have you ever heard of a leadership PAC?
No.
Leadership PACs are in control of the candidate. And those leadership PACs are essentially granted by Congress for members of Congress and former members of Congress that they can use for expenses that they can't expense through their regular campaign committees. And one of the things that they use leadership PACs for commonly is, let's say that you and I are both in Congress and I want to become Speaker of the House. Well, I might give you a bunch of money from my leadership PAC to help you win because I've become friends with you and I know you will support me in my quest to be the leader. So once again, it's a form of pay to play. We use the carrot of money to get where we want to go. And that's the bias that we all have genetically. Genetically, evolutionary level, we all want to survive and do better. So biological organisms that cooperate tend to be more successful. And when somebody gives you something, you have a sense of gratitude. We talked about that before.
Yeah.
So if I give you something, most likely, my friendliness and it goes up. Our relationship.
We become closer.
Right.
We become more important to one another.
Right. And so leadership PACs tend to be anything from throwing a pizza party for your campaign staff, or taking a trip to Europe, or sending you money or somebody else money in order to influence that person's vote or help to put them over the finish line in their own campaigns. To my mind, it's a horrible thing.
So leadership PACs can give you money. They can this doesn't sound right. So say, okay, so for a female, I got to have a really big wardrobe, a lot bigger wardrobe than most men have to have if they're going to be doing any form of business. I have to have hundreds of different suits, different one every day. And are you saying I could actually go to my leadership PAC and say, hey, by the way, I'm Sarah Palin and I've got a lovely figure and I present well, so I need money for all my clothes? Is it a leadership PAC? Or send me to Europe because I'm gonna, whatever.
Well, there is some. There always is some justification, and I cannot recite to you every single qualification that goes along with that. But just know that in Washington, D.C., for example, there is distinctions with the FEC and with the IRS and with blah 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 blah, that says what's the difference between a lunch and a dinner? What's the difference between a snack and a lunch? And they define that sometimes as like a roll and a salad, or it's a drink only, or there's just snack food or crudité or something like that.
I've come across that. Yeah.
Right. And so there's those levels of distinctions. And they allow people to weasel past all kinds of rules that we put up, in defense of integrity, but we get around them. So to your question, there very well may be, and I don't want to say definitively yes or no, but I do know there's a lot of blowback on leadership PACs because it's money that can be spent by the candidate that is oftentimes are for expenses at the candidate's discretion. And they can pay for things that a legal campaign cannot. Why do we need
so
that?
we're really looking at a huge need for reform, and it's absolutely right. Unless we know what people's positions are on campaign finance, and we choose people who are in favor of public finance and will not take money from the rich and famous or the corporations, or then this will continue. Because it's in everybody's best. It's in the best interest of the people being elected, or the people who are running the show, for it to continue.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I don't want to try to say that every corporation, every union, every wealthy person is nefarious in their design when giving money.
Absolutely.
But we do know that exists. We must reduce the chances of that happening. And if we change our focus from where we get our source of campaign funding, it changes the character of the campaign itself and the candidate. So, for example, in some cases, many cases, actually, it's not just some, probably in most cases, you'll see large companies, say FedEx or Google or Amazon or somebody else, they will give an equal share of money to both Democrats and Republicans just because they
Hmm.
want to curry favor with them.
Right.
But they're the
Access.
incumbent. They're the incumbents typically, not challengers. And the
Hmm.
reason for that is they have a legislative record. So if FedEx wants to have success, they can give out certain amount of campaign contributions to people who they know are not going to elevate the UPS or elevate the mail service. So they know how they stand and they want to continue to influence them because there may be legislation that they have to vote on coming up that would affect their company interest. And when they give them that level of money, it
Hmm.
makes it more difficult for an incumbent, for an incumbent to be challenged. So when we talk about term limits, some of these term limits would be
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
come as a result
Hmm.
of the incumbent not having an unfair advantage with money.
Right. So it's the same thing of it's the old checks and balances thing. And if we put in place systems that condone the best behavior, and we put in place systems that um, work against bad behavior and temptation and opportunity, then we end up with more integrity in
Right.
in the
We have all kinds of
in
rules in
government.
society like that, right?
Hmm.
We have
It's
rules
yeah,
on drugs, on gambling, on smoking, on all the
yeah,
vices.
yeah.
All the vices, we have some sort of rules about them.
Well,
It
that's
is,
on the legal side, and then if you look at it, you look at any, you go into any corporation, and you know that they're putting in place checks and balances so that the funds that they have in play are go where they want them to go, rather than into some white collar criminal's pocket. And so it's common sense, it's best practice to put those in place. But we've got the opposite. In what we've got is almost encouraging to maybe not well, if you do nothing, you're encouraging you're doing nothing. It's as much as encouraging the bad things to happen.
yeah, there's this ideological purity that they are still employing to make decisions about freedom of speech that
Aha.
are not
Yes.
relevant to the free world, to the practical world.
Right.
Until we
Right.
come to that understanding, listen, there you asked me earlier about things we can do. Well, you got to start with your local politicians and ask them, do you stand for campaign finance reform? Because we have to normalize it. Right now, it's not
Yeah.
normal for that to happen. So you get pushback. The second thing is you'll find candidates say, well, yeah, but I need to compete with, independent expenditures. Well, you can't compete with independent expenditures. They're independent, right? So you can't rule that you can't make a decision on campaign finance laws based on independent expenditures. Secondly, you have to vote for those people that are going to be in favor of some kind of campaign finance reform. Uh, and we have to insist on daylight. We have to make sure we have
Hmm.
transparency, and people
Hmm.
can find these numbers by looking, as you stated earlier, in county and city records. But sometimes that's difficult. Like in our San Luis Obispo County, if you want to go down and look up contribution records, it's very difficult. You have to go do it in the county clerk's office or in the downstairs the government building, and you have to sit there at a computer. They won't just hand you a sheet or say, "Here's a website that allows you to go do that."
So
That
it's
was
not online. You can't get it online at
no,
the oh
not in my
golly.
experience. Now maybe that's changed, but the last
Well,
time I tried to do that,
yeah, I don't know that I've ever I'm trying to figure out how I have known. I
well,
have looked. I have seen. I mean, I looked at Adam Hills. I've looked at other supervisorial candidates, campaign donations. I know I got them from somewhere,
usually they
but
tell you the
yeah.
totals, but they don't always tell you the contributors.
Uh
And
huh.
those are usually, well, I don't want to get off topic about that because each county, state, wherever there are people listening from,
The rules are
may have a
different.
different
Hmm.
system.
Yeah.
But you can
Yeah.
go on websites like Open Secrets. Open Secrets is
Yes.
a phenomenal website that lists the contributions and where those contributions are coming from and who's taking the most lobbying money and what the totals are, how much money is from out of the district and how much money is from in the district. So there are places you can source that. So you got to ask the question and make it part of the litmus test for whether or not a candidate is well. You got to make it insisted to be part of a candidate's platform, and that means some people need to actually get out and
Right.
run for office. office too, local office, and run for that. And then we have to normalize it. Then we need to push legislation that offers the opportunity for publicly funded elections. Look, there's been at this point since 1787, there have been over 14,000 constitutional amendments to the United States Constitution, of which we have only 27. Right. So the likelihood of a constitutional amendment getting passed is very unlikely. Mm-hmm. There are other disclosure types of legislation out there. The congressman from Maryland has one out. There's the Disclose Act. There are various pieces of legislation that we need to support.
Right. Well, and I think at the end of the day, anything that ever works is about numbers. It's always about numbers, whether it's numbers of people or numbers of money. But if enough of us as people and voters insist, eventually the numbers do win. And we have evidence that this system works because it's worked so well in Seattle. And so, you're the common man, the common woman who's voting, who lives in a community, can see the benefit of it. And I think that the times you don't see it is when you want to unduly influence. People who are against it either maybe don't understand it or perhaps don't have pure motive.
Well, this is a long slog, unfortunately. We also need to be sure that we are electing representatives who will one day vote about a Supreme Court justice or confirmation of other justices, that those justices understand the community interest in freedom of speech in elections and money, etc.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we have to do.
Well, that's helpful. At least it feels like there are some things that we can do that can bring change. And change is incredibly slow often. But if you don't start on that road, it doesn't happen.
Yes.
So we've got to start down that road.
We do.
Well, was there anything else that you wanted to raise on this, Bill? If not, we can probably tie up for this evening.
It's an issue that has many tentacles that we could go on with for hours. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on your podcast and share this information with people. I think most people get intimidated by the Byzantine rules and by the layer upon layer of different rules from one race to another, from county supervisor to president of the United States. They all have different rules about contributions and money in politics. But at the heart of it, it's like an overly complex system that is designed to keep the system in place.
Right.
And we have to break that mold. We have to break that grip that they have on channeling billions of dollars into our election system to influence the outcomes.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And is there anywhere that people can go to get more information about this? Do you have anything published or anything written or anything that, apart from they can, of course, come to Corruption Chronicles and they can go to Open Secrets.
Right.
Is there any other way people can find out more?
Well, I have a website called Citizens Congress, but I have to admit right now, though, that I have not contributed to that for a couple of years because I've been so consumed with other things in my life right now. But there are a number of organizations devoted to money in politics. Represent Us is one. But I really think the best source is Open Secrets because they're current. They have people who are researching the FEC, the different reporting agencies on a daily basis. Wow. And reporting on this money that's coming in and so forth. And so they're really the most contemporary and most aggressive nonprofit organization out there tracking the money in politics. I think their motto is very clever too. It's something like count the money, make change.
Okay, so let me ask a difficult question. Who funds them? How do they get their money to do all this?
They're a nonpartisan organization, and they take contributions from people that want to support disclosure in politics. And
Okay, good.
they put that clear up on their website. They are not
Hmm.
partisan, so
Great.
you can send them money if you want to continue their good work. It's good investment in our democracy to do that.
Thank you. That's good. So we'll tie up now, Bill, and I know you'll be back again. We'll talk about some other things. And for folks who've been listening, this has been Corruption Chronicles. You can read some more about some of the issues that I discussed tonight in The Happiest Corruption, Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California beach town. And that's available on Amazon. You just go to Amazon and you search Happiest Corruption, and it will come up. In fact, if you Google Happiest Corruption, it will probably come up. I would also suggest that you may want to go to my website, and that is debbiepeterson.com, DebbiePeterson, my name.com. And you'll find links to purchase the book, but you'll also find an online course. It's a 6-hour course that I've done called Double Dias, Adventures in Local Government. And I've put that together because it took me, I would say, really 10 years to understand what was really happening in my community. And in 6 hours, I'll give you what I learned, and you'll be much further ahead in influencing local government and making constructive change in your community. If you are interested in doing that, it'll put you streaks ahead. It'll fast track your work there. So that is also available on my website as an online course. And I think that's us. It's a wrap for tonight. And again, thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for having me on the show, and thanks for doing all this hard work.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.